Now, Mrs. Bourne, it distresses me to have to intrude on your recent great sorrow, Sir Francis had said diffidently. He had a curiously diffident manner, which was rather charming. But it is my duty to ask you this. Were you and your husband a few months ago not contemplating a divorce? Certainly not, said Madeleine, indignantly, while ears everywhere were pricked up. You swear to that?
Really, Sir Bernard, interposed the judge, is this relevant?
Quite, your lordship. It will be apparent in a moment. You swear to that, Mrs. Bourne? Certainly I do, Madeleine replied with womanly dignity. But, to put it bluntly, you and your husband did not get on well together, apologized Sir Francis. My husband and I loved each other very dearly. Madeleine rolled her eyes at the judge in mute appeal. The judge rolled his eyes at Sir Francis, but without effect.
But like most married people, you had your quarrels, suggested Sir Francis, with a deprecatory smile.
We'd only been married 18 months. If you wouldn't mind answering the question, Mrs. Bourne. Madeleine drew herself up. If I must, the answer is no. My husband and I had never quarrelled. It was at this point that Dr. Bickleigh laughed. Never quarrelled, when it had been notorious in Wyvern's Cross that... But no doubt the woman really believed it. Her powers of self-deception were incredible. Yes, no doubt she had already, in the brief weeks of her widowhood, persuaded herself that her short married life had been idyllic. Now he saw what Sir Francis was getting at. But, like most women, pursued Sir Francis diffidently, you had your moments of jealousy? Oh, certainly not. My husband had never given me cause for such a thing. Oh, not after your marriage, no doubt, but before it. You never expressed jealousy of the women your husband had been fond of before he met you? Madeleine hesitated. The judge shuffled his papers uneasily. I'm afraid I must press you for an answer, Mrs. Bourne. No, never. Sir Francis suddenly shed his diffident manner. He glared at her. Perhaps you will tell me that you did not keep him up till 4 o'clock in the morning for nights, for weeks on end, till his health was seriously affected, while you raved at him over the women he had loved before he even knew of your existence. Madeleine shrank back in the box and went sallowly pale. Her mouth set like a rat trap. The judge leaned forward.
Sir Francis, I must ask you to justify this remarkable line of cross-examination. I have allowed you considerable latitude, but I cannot see that the examination of this witness has made it relevant for...
Certainly, my lord, snapped Sir Francis, leaping for this opportunity. My cross-examination is directed to establish that the evidence given by this witness is totally unreliable, that she is notoriously untruthful, malicious, and mentally unbalanced, and I intend to call evidence of my own to prove this. As the newspapers again had it, sensation. Dr. Bickleigh leaned over the dock, his face blazing with joy. He could have embraced his counsel on both cheeks. For the third time in his life, that unbodily exaltation lifted him into a sphere of delirious happiness.
You realize, of course, what you're doing, Sir Francis?
The judge had recovered himself, if others had not.
Perfectly, my lord. My client is prepared to face any cross-examination of a personal nature. He has nothing to conceal.
The judge glanced at the clock. The time was 4:45.
Nevertheless, I think I will adjourn the court now, to give you an opportunity to think things over.
That is very kind of your lordship. I am much indebted. Gunhill was nearly as excited as Dr. Bickleigh himself.
The case is as good as won. He led her on, you see, till she'd contradicted herself on a few small points and then established her in the mood he wanted. Naturally, she played up. Then he came out into the open.
But you haven't got the evidence about...
Oh, yes, we have. Indeed we have. Most certainly. I followed up that line of inquiry very closely indeed, you may be sure of that. Mrs. Bourne's evidence was the only really damaging thing against you, and if we could discredit that, you may be sure I concentrated on that line very closely.
But you said Sir Francis pretended.
He didn't want you told, in case he changed his line at the last minute. He wanted to get the exact impression she made on the jury first. Now we can go ahead. I can tell you now, Bickleigh, we've got the most conclusive evidence, both of her untruthfulness and her lack of balance, too, to say nothing of her downright malice towards yourself.
I've always said she was mad, exulted Dr. Bickleigh. Not certifiable, unfortunately, but certainly over the borderline. I told you so dozens of times.
Exactly. Precisely. And very fortunate that you did so. And the beauty of the position, you see,
said Mr. Gunhill, rubbing his hands so vigorously that they positively rasped,
is that, though they're entitled now to attack your personal character, to do so will only damage their own case. If you've been frank with me, and of course you have, of course, there's nothing for them to attack you on, except your somewhat, well, shall we say, indiscriminate relations with women, and it won't benefit them at all to show you as indiscriminate. Their whole case rests on your affection for one single woman. The more women, the less motive.
Of course, Dr. Bickleigh grinned. Very funny.
Anyhow, I think that will be the end of Mrs. Bourne.
It was. The next morning, in place of Madeleine, a medical certificate arrived to the effect that Mrs. Bourne was in bed, suffering from nervous prostration and shock, and was not in a fit state to attend the court. Sir Francis looked at the jury so meaningly that they felt quite uncomfortable. Dr. Bickleigh sat back in his chair in the dock and prepared to listen to the evidence of Chatford with nothing but an academic interest. As Gunhill said, the case was won already. Chatford certainly did not advance the cause of the prosecution very much. His evidence was limited to his own participation in the attempted poisoning case, the tea party, his own subsequent illness, Dr. Bickleigh's attempts to see him, and their sequel. It was all very vague. Dr. Bickleigh's serenity grew. Really, if this was the best they could do... Why, it was all innuendo and inference, nothing definite at all. Sir Francis handled Chatford very nastily in cross-examination, too. Hinted at his jealousy and malicious feelings towards the prisoner, just eliciting enough to be able to damage the value of his evidence, leaving the suggestion that Chatford was a vindictive busybody. It was all very clever. The medical evidence came next, headed by Lydston. Even Lydston, Dr. Bickleigh found he could listen to without anger. Lydston reciting in his precise tones the unprofessional conduct of the prisoner, his diagnosis without any examination at all, the startling nature of that diagnosis, and the way he and Chatford had conspired to do their piece of play-acting. That play-acting? Well, talk of unprofessional conduct. Towards the end of all this, Dr. Bickleigh did begin to feel a little uneasy. Lydston was damnably convincing. But the cross-examination, eliciting Lydston's admission that he had wilfully deceived the prisoner as to Chatford's symptoms, and so could not be surprised at whatever he diagnosed, went some way to restore the balance. Sir Tamerton Folliot's evidence confirmed this restoration. It was most impressive, but did not amount to much. However, what was there was almost more helpful to the defence than to the prosecution. Sir Tamerton was followed by the various experts. Dr. Ryder, bacteriologist to the Home Office, came first. A large man with a big black beard who spoke with extreme confidence. Invited by the Attorney-General to tell the court what he had discovered with regard to the culture submitted to him for examination, he did so with gusto. The medium submitted to me for examination was an ordinary gelatine plate. There were several colonies on the plate, all presenting the thin, notched, irregular appearance of the colon typhoid group. I carried out the usual processes and identified the different organisms. I identified Bacillus coli communis, Bacillus enteroides, Bacillus paratyphosus B, Bacillus typhosus, Bacillus iatrica, and others of this same group. Bacillus enteroides, or Gertner's bacillus, very decidedly predominated. Thank you, Doctor. And as regards the contents of the capsule, which you also examined? This contained a small portion of gelatin, which corresponded in shape and size with a gap on one edge of the gelatin plate. On this portion was a group of Bacillus enteroides only. No other organism was present except Bacillus enteroides. This applies equally to the residue of the potted meat, which was also submitted to me for examination. This contained Bacillus enteroides only. I see. To the layman, Bacillus enteroides means the germ which produces typhoid fever? That is so. Perhaps you could explain to the jury the leading characteristics of this bacillus? Certainly, agreed Dr. Ryder heartily, and turned to the jury. Bacillus enteroides, or Gertner's bacillus, is a leading member of the large colon typhoid group. As regards its morphology, it is actively motile, carries several flagellae, forms no spores, and is gram-negative. Like all others of this group, it is aerobic. It grows well on ordinary media and is easy to cultivate. So far as concerns its cultural characteristics, it ferments glucose livulose, maltose, galactose, arabinose, raffinose, mainite, sorbite, dulcite, and dextrin, with production of acid and gas, but has no action on saccharose, nor, as a rule, on salicin and glycerin. It gives very little or no indole, and does not give the Vosges Proscure reaction. In litmus milk... The Attorney-General managed to stem this flow. Yes, but if you could manage to put it a little less technically, Doctor, and I was meaning more particularly its effects on the human frame. Oh, I beg your pardon. Well, it is established now that Bacillus enteroides is the most frequent cause of meat poisoning. It has been discovered in meat from pigs, cattle, horses, and fish. Symptoms due to action of the toxins, and their onset is generally rapid, not to say sudden. And these symptoms are? Usually vomiting, diarrhea, pains in the abdomen and head, prostration, collapse, cold sweats, rigors, cramps, rashes, and furred tongue, replied Dr. Ryder with gusto. Exactly. Now, you have heard Mrs. Bourne's and Mr. Chatford's symptoms described in court here. Is it your opinion that these are consistent with poisoning by Bacillus enteroides? Entirely consistent. And you actually identified this organism in Mr. Chatford's eliminations? I did. You have no doubt that Mr. Chatford's illness and Mrs. Bourne's indisposition were caused by this typhoid bacillus having found its way into their systems?
None at all.
Now, you examined the gelatin plate also for Bacillus botulinus, the germ which causes the disease known as botulism. Did you find any?
None.
Could you have expected to do so?
No, I could not.
Bacillus botulinus is anaerobic.
In other words, it dies if exposed to the air. The medium, as prepared, was suitable for aerobic organisms only.
Bacillus botulinus could not have survived,
nor were there any traces of this bacillus in the eliminations.
Are the symptoms of botulism similar to those produced by Bacillus enteridides, which is the germ of typhoid or enteric fever?
Certainly not. They are totally different. In the case of botulism, the symptoms are headache, dizziness, followed by diplopia, partial ptosis of both eyelids, dilated pupils, paralysis of the facial muscles, the larynx and the pharynx, with stasis of the intestines, giving rise to constipation. Vomiting is usually absent.
So that in many ways the symptoms of botulism are directly opposite to those produced by Bacillus enteridides.
That is so.
In your opinion, would it be possible for a medical man, judging the case on the symptoms alone, to diagnose a case of poisoning by Bacillus enteridides as botulism?
Not if he was in his sane senses,
replied Dr. Ryder robustly. The Attorney-General went on to persuade his witness to translate some of his earlier technicalities into language more fitted to the comprehension of 10 farmers and 2 professional men. Dr. Bickleigh was amused how useful his blunders in bacteriology were proving. In his case, a little knowledge was a blessed thing. If he had made his culture of Bacillus botulinus properly, instead of managing to cultivate apparently every possible other bacillus that had been present in the Samford boy except this particular one, it might have looked very nasty for him indeed. He also congratulated himself most warmly on the artistic feeling which had caused him to infect the residue of the potted meat with such admirable results. The Attorney-General proceeded to dispel this complacency. Reverting to the gelatin plate, he asked blandly whether the cultures on that might have been obtained from the potted meat. Dr. Ryder was emphatic that they could not. Only one organism was present in the potted meat. This would not account for Bacillus paratyphosus B, Bacillus typhosus, and the rest on the plate. How then, in his opinion, might such a plate have been prepared? Sir Francis objected, and the judge allowed the objection. Such a very speculative question could not be permitted. The Attorney-General contented himself with getting his witnesses' repeated assertions that such a possibility was untenable. The infection of the potted meat might have come from one of the cultures of Bacillus enteridides on the plate. The plate could not have been infected from the potted meat alone. Naturally, the defence had had their eyes opened by their own experts to this fact, but Dr. Bickleigh did not at all like the Attorney-General's very emphatic handling of it. In cross-examination, the explanation was put forward, and Dr. Ryder quite admitted its feasibility. The predominance of Bacillus enteridides showed that the greater part of the cultures did, in fact, come from the potted meat. The remaining organisms, which, though present in quantity, were so much less prevalent, were due to another experiment, which Dr. Bickleigh had made at the same time on the same gelatin plate with eliminations from the district isolation hospital. Fortunately, Dr. Bickleigh had had a patient in the isolation hospital at the time to account for a visit there, In re-examination, however, he quite agreed with the Attorney General that it was exceedingly odd to make two different cultural experiments on the same plate, and not to say valueless, for the more powerful organism would only overrun and destroy the weaker one. Moreover, he would, in this case, have expected to find the cultures in a decidedly less advanced state. In further cross-examination, he could not be made to retract this, but only to repeat that nevertheless the explanation of the defence was quite consistent with the facts as he observed them. On the whole, a witness by no means helpful to the defence, felt Dr. Bickleigh, as he watched the broad back disappear with considerable relief. It had been a nasty couple of hours. The evidence of Dr. Sowerby, the Home Office pathologist who followed, though lengthy, amounted to nothing more than that he had been able to find in the body of Mrs. Bickleigh no traces of natural disease. Certainly nothing to account for her headaches and ill health. No, there had been no neoplasm on the brain. In cross-examination, he agreed that not only was death perfectly consistent with an overdose of morphia, but that from the post-mortem appearances, which he had heard described, this was almost certainly the cause. Dr. Sowerby was confirmed in this opinion by Sir James Cleryhugh, medical adviser to the Home Office. As, however, the cause of death was not in question, this did not advance matters much either way. Dr. Bickleigh grew more and more bored. He was rather proud of being bored. Had anyone ever been bored with his own trial for murder before? Hardly. But really, there seemed nothing to go on with, now that Madeleine had been so effectively quashed. Compared with that, nothing else seriously counted. The next witness, however, imported a little more interest into the proceedings. This was Mr. Pym, the senior official analyst to the Home Office. He had to admit that in the organs handed to him for examination by Dr. Sowerby, he had been unable to find traces of any poison at all. The morphia, which it was in evidence that Mrs. Bickleigh had been taking in such large doses, would in any case have disappeared after such a lapse of time as would any other vegetable poison. But of any metallic poison, such as arsenic, there was no trace at all. The only unusual substances which he had discovered were vanadium, present in surprisingly large quantities, and a very little gold. He had been quite unable to account for the presence of these two so rarely used in medicine. Dr. Bickleigh smiled inwardly. He knew where the vanadium and gold came from. Unable, that was, proceeded Mr. Pym, up till only a few days ago. Had the combination then suggested something to him? Yes, it had. Dr. Bickleigh sat up alertly. This was something new. By a curious chance, there had then occurred to Mr. Pym's memory a proprietary preparation which had appeared a few years ago and which, in the course of his duties, he had to analyse. This preparation was known as farolite, and it was one of the many proprietary medicines designed to correct uric acid diathesis, of which samples are circulated from time to time among members of the medical profession. This particular preparation had not been a success, owing to its high cost and to the fact that it induced violent headaches, and it had not been taken up by the profession. A sick feeling took possession of Dr. Bickleigh. They were going to disclose everything, show exactly what he had done, expose to the glare of expert examination that secret plan which he had thought so undetectable. This was disaster. By calling on every atom of his self-control, he was able to sit impassively through the terrible evidence that followed. Listening to his method being described in the minutest detail, only as a theory, of course, but the way the man spoke showed that he had not the faintest doubt of the truth of it. hearing Mr. Pym give it as his unalterable conviction that this preparation could certainly have induced such headaches as Mrs. Bickleigh suffered from, and he could think of no other drug which would. Hearing Mr. Pym quite unshaken in cross-examination, realizing the prosecution's point being made more and more dependent on proof that Dr. Bickleigh had had access to this preparation, and watching the feeling in court becoming more and more tensely crystallized on this one question. Then, listening to the representative of the firm in question detailing, with a ledger in front of him, that on this date and on that date, on the other date, Dr. Bickleigh had ordered supplies of ferrolite, and hearing the Attorney General asking, in tones undisguisedly triumphant, that the ledger be put in as an exhibit in the case. There was no doubt about it. The prosecution had managed to close up a link in the chain, which more than made up for the one that Madeleine had snapped. The last secret of the way he had killed Julia had been snatched from him and held up like a conjurer's handkerchief before the jury, turned this way and that, left with no further possibility of deception. Dr. Bickleigh, turning for a moment unguardedly harassed eyes upon them, looked hastily away again as he saw how they avoided his look. The recalling of Dr. Sowerby and Sir James Cleryhugh to confirm Mr. Pym's conclusion was hardly necessary, but the prosecution would leave nothing to chance. They meant to hang him. At last, the medical aspect of the case was finished, and with it went Dr. Bickleigh's buoyant hopes. He hadn't a chance now. Only one witness of any importance remained to be called, Ivy. She entered the box shrinkingly and timidly, keeping her eyes turned from her lover in the dock. Dr. Bickleigh, too depressed almost to keep up appearances, looked at her dully. They were kind to her. Everybody on counsels and solicitors' benches, almost everyone in court, knew that she had been the prisoner's mistress, but no reference was made to the fact. It was not necessary to the prosecution's case. But something else was. As Ivy quaveringly told her story of meeting him on the fatal afternoon, Dr. Bickleigh had a flash of terrible premonition. He saw with sudden, awful clarity the ghastliness of a blunder he had made. In his anxiety to show Chatford's interested maliciousness, he had shown too Ivy's unreliability as a witness against him. The case for the prosecution depended entirely on being able to prove that he had had time that afternoon to get back to Fairlawn between the time of his meeting the two villagers on the road and being seen by Ivy. On Ivy alone hung his chance of proving that he could not. Ivy and her evidence as to the time when she gave it to him. But now Ivy was suspect. They would press her, hint that she was wrong, hint even that she was wilfully altering that time to help her old lover. Dr. Bickleigh listened, with face set so rigidly that the muscles of it quite ached. His jaws were clamped tightly together. Ivy knew. Ivy knew that he had killed Julia, that he had tried to kill Chatford and Madeleine. Dr. Bickleigh felt her knowledge instinctively and surely. Ivy knew. But she was not going to give him away. Oh, bless the girl. Bless her. When he was free, if he ever was free, he would make it up to her. She loved him in spite of what she knew he had done. Loved him and still wanted to marry him. She should marry him. Next time there should be no mistake. By God, no. He owed her that. And he would pay with Chatford's life. His face relaxed. The set lines of his jaw lost their hardness. His lost hope began to creep back. The Attorney General bunched his gown a little higher on his hip. He scratched, very delicately with his forefinger, at the extreme point of his nose. His junior sat up. He recognized the nervous habit, which meant that his leader was going to make a very special effort. Ivy. What a slender thread, Dr. Bickleigh felt, on which to hang his last chances of escape from the hangman's rope. And yet the thread had held. During the next few minutes, Dr. Bickleigh watched, with mask-like face, the thread chafe, fray, and snap. With a tear streaming down her face, Ivy at last admitted to the Attorney General's persistence that the time had not been as she had given it. It was a quarter of an hour later. The prisoner had told her long afterwards that her watch must have been wrong. It was all up. When his own counsel rose to open to the court the case for the defence, Dr. Bickleigh had no hope left at all. One by one his props had been knocked away from under him. Sir Francis was fighting a hopeless case. Dr. Bickleigh listened with complete apathy. It was not for quite an appreciable time that it dawned on him that, if the hope was a desperate one, Sir Francis himself seemed unaccountably ignorant of the fact. He spoke with confidence. His diffident manner of cross-examination, which had led so many unsuspectingly superior witnesses to let out things which they bitterly regretted afterwards, had given place to a resolute and finely tempered indignation. Dr. Bickleigh began to understand that it was a cruel and scandalous thing that he had been put on trial at all, to answer a charge of mere possibility of opportunity and imputed motive, without a shred of real evidence to support the case against him. He was so surprised to learn that there was no real evidence against him, in spite of what had undoubtedly gone before, that his apathy began to melt. It melted faster and faster. There was no evidence against him. That was astonishing, but it was perfectly true. Sir Francis showed it quite clearly. What he had considered the most damning facts, conclusively proved, turned out to be neither facts at all nor proved, but one and all capable of the most innocent and far more probable explanations. Of course Dr. Bickleigh had ordered Farrelite, openly, in his own name, without concealment. Why ever not? He had nothing to hide in doing so. Farrelite was known to him as having obtained the most remarkable results in the complaint for which he required it for Mrs. Bickleigh, namely, excess of uric acid. That it had given rise to headaches, his client neither knew, nor even now believed. In any case, he had certainly not connected Mrs. Bickleigh's headaches, which no less an authority than Sir Tamerton Folliot had agreed must be due to quite other and perfectly natural causes, with Farrelite at all. Why should he? After all, one can hardly open the human brain to discover whether there is a tumour on it or not. When all the facts known to medical science point to the supposition that there is, an ordinary general practitioner must accept the verdict. As for Ivy, well, somehow or other Sir Francis showed quite kindly but very plainly that Ivy simply did not matter one way or the other. Mrs. Chatford and Mrs. Bourne, interested witnesses. Very painful to have to impugn a word given in such solemn circumstances, but really his duty compelled him to. Ivy and Madeleine simply did not count. As for the rest of the case for the Crown, pure guesswork. Pure guesswork from beginning to end. Guesswork, 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 guesswork. As for the secondary charge, well, really, Sir Francis just smiled. Obviously there was nothing else to do. The potted meat had been found to be infected, That was the whole point, was it not? Found by the police themselves to be infected. Just as it would have been if the prisoner's story were true. Just as it would not have been if the prisoner's story were untrue. Infected. There was simply no case to answer. I call the prisoner Edmund Alfred Bickleigh. Dr. Bickleigh felt as if somebody had suddenly hit him a violent blow in the stomach. He walked on shaking legs from the dock to the witness box. Even in his moments of highest confidence he had dreaded this ordeal. Even when he had considered it only part of the whole unpleasant prelude to liberty. Occasionally he had tried to persuade himself that it would be fun to cross rapiers with no less a person than the Attorney General himself, and beat him at his own game. And secretly he had, in spite of his fears, been sure that he would beat him. But it was only an effort to fight the remains of that strange inferiority complex of his, which made him dread the battle while still not doubting the ultimate victory. Now that the ordeal had come, he felt sick and faint with terror. But he must control himself. He must not show it. An innocent man would never show fear. He gripped the edges of the witness box till his knuckles showed up starkly white. Sir Francis saw his agitation so desperately concealed, and pretended to be busy for a moment with his brief to give him time to recover. Then he smiled at him, in a perfectly charming and friendly way, and said, "Dr. Bickleigh, did you administer to your wife the dose of morphia which killed her?" "No, I did not," said Dr. Bickleigh indignantly. And with the words, his fear fell completely away from him, so completely that he was quite astonished. Stage fright. That's what it must have been. Simply stage fright, and now it had gone. Besides, he was sure now that he could detect a friendly feeling in the court towards him. They were on his side, even the jury. It was Sir Francis and himself and the spectators and the jury and everyone against the Attorney General with his beastly insinuations. Dr. Bickleigh went on to delight Sir Francis by being a perfect witness. He had been thoroughly rehearsed, of course, as to the line his examination would take, though not as to its exact questions. The right answers fell from him one by one, delivered in just the right tone. Beforehand, he had spent nerve-racked hours debating his attitude in this witness box. If too calm and collected, might not that be construed as the brazenness of the criminal? If flustered and anxious, as a guilty conscience? Now he did not worry. The right attitude had come to him instinctively. He just knew it was the right attitude. Even when the Attorney General rose to cross-examine, that nauseating fear did not return. He felt no fear at all. His wits were all about him. He was going to beat the man at his own game, and it was going to be fun. And it was fun. The Attorney General pressed him hard. About Madeleine, about his alibi, his opportunity of getting back to the house, his wife's illness, the Farrelite, and on top of that, about the still more dubious, yes, really the far more dubious, circumstances of the attempted murder charge, the germ culture and all the rest of it. But Dr. Bickleigh never lost his head for a moment, not a moment. His formidable opponent got no change out of him at all. The few points on which it was impossible to avoid being more or less equivocal were put right in cross-examination, and Dr. Bickleigh returned to the dock, hard put to it, not to grin derisively in the Attorney General's face. It would be nice to know that he had had no small part in obtaining his own acquittal. Dr. Bickleigh had seldom felt so intensely pleased with himself. Sir Francis called his other witnesses. Ever so many people were anxious to save Dr. Bickleigh's neck. There were witnesses to his character, his amiability, his popularity, his affectionate relations with his wife. There were even the Crustantons. There was Mrs. Hone, a most whole-hearted witness, to swear indignantly that the sandwiches had never been out of her sight for a single instant. There was a handwriting expert, to swear just as firmly that the prescription and its signature was a forgery, and a most obvious one too. There were expert medical, bacteriological, and pathological witnesses, all prepared confidently to contradict the expert medical, bacteriological, and pathological witnesses for the Crown, simply and solely, of course, because the latter were mistaken, not for a moment because the former disliked them. Names just as eminent, too. More so, really, because unbiased. Then there were witnesses to prove Madeleine's predilection for lies, maids from London and Devonshire, to prove hearing their mistress sobbing and howling at 4 o'clock in the morning at her unfortunate husband because he had been rash enough to look fondly on other women before he ever so much as knew that she herself existed. Yes, sobbing and howling. Well, like a wild beast it was, admitted a fat and motherly cook, whose very appearance amounted to a certificate of character in Dr. Bickleigh's favour. Yes, like a wild beast. You could hear it all over the house. Scream too, she would. Well, you couldn't help but hear it, try as you would. Made me and the other maids feel quite ashamed it did, and that's a fact. People came from Wyvern's Cross too. People who liked the doctor more than Madeleine, and there were plenty of them, to prove Mrs. Bourne's malicious stories against the doctor and the palpable lies she had told. Sir Francis offered to call 65 different witnesses on this point alone, till the Attorney-General had to accept the evidence as given. But even then, nothing was left to chance. Expert witnesses in yet another branch were called to prove that Madeleine was suffering from a not common but certainly not rare neurotic complaint, which in this case had had its outlet in this insane retrospective jealousy, but might have taken, or still take, any other similar form. Insane? Well, in a way, really, yes. A form of mental unbalance, almost amounting to insanity. Not certifiable, though, of course, just on the safe side of the borderline. Giving rise to delusions? Oh, certainly. Such as that people were in love with her who were in reality nothing of the sort? Precisely. The exact kind of delusion which could occur. A lack of proportion, in fact, about everything in any way concerning herself, which touched, in some respects, genuine megalomania, and meant a complete disregard of truth and fact. Conceit gone mad. Very sad, very sad. But sadder still for any unfortunate man who happened to marry one of these raving creatures. And decent parents, of course, would prevent such a daughter from marrying. Oh, yes, they would know her to be unbalanced, certainly. But, of course, in this case, nobody mentioned Madeleine any more. A prosecution's chief witness could never have been more effectively disposed of. The trial dragged on. Dr. Bickleigh's confidence was now unshakable. He knew, just knew now, that an adverse verdict was impossible. So did Gunhill. So did Sir Francis himself. Every evening, after the expenditure of a few more £1,000 in the day's proceedings, they would meet in Dr. Bickleigh's cell for a few minutes before he was taken back to the prison, rub their hands vigorously and smile at each other. It was a foregone conclusion. Sir Francis told Dr. Bickleigh frankly that he had never been so confident of a verdict in the whole of his career before. Even the Attorney-General's closing speech did not shake Dr. Bickleigh's settled optimism. The man was simply making the worst of a bad job. No one could fail to see that, not even the jury. The unfairness of allowing him to speak last, after Sir Francis, did not really matter. Dr. Bickleigh simply smiled openly at the ludicrous imputation that he had committed one murder and tried to commit 2 others. One simply did not do such things. The judge was not at all bad. Not at all bad. Dr. Bickleigh, listening critically to the summing up, was quite prepared to admit that. On 1 or 2 points, perhaps, he did not emphasize, as strongly as he should have done, the absurdity of the suggestions of the prosecution, and it was annoying of him to appear to attach quite as much weight to the evidence, such as it could be called, against Dr. Bickleigh as in his favour. Still, on the whole, he really was quite fair, but far too long. Far, far too long. Good heavens, how that measured, unemotional voice droned on and on and on. Would it never come to an end? It did. The jury filed out to consider their verdict. Dr. Bickleigh retired from the public's gaze. He was very chatty with his warders during the time of waiting. They were not bad fellows at all. He must look them up when he was free, and they would all have a good laugh over this business. He told them quite plainly that a verdict of guilty was utterly out of the question. They were inclined to agree with him. The jury was only absent a bare 40 minutes. "I told you so," Dr. Bickleigh smiled as they went up the stairs into the courtroom together. One of the warders, with gloomy leanings, had said that under the hour in a doubtful case like this always meant an acquittal. Dr. Bickleigh was not in the least nervous, not even perturbed. His confidence was undiminished as he looked over the faces of the jury in a kind of proprietary way. 12 good men and true. Sir Francis was not even in court. Gunhill had told Dr. Bickleigh that he had an urgent engagement elsewhere which he had left to keep as soon as the summing up was over. To wait for the formality of the verdict, Sir Francis had felt, was a mere waste of time.
"Gentlemen of the jury, have you all agreed upon your verdict?"
"We have."
"Do you find the prisoner at the bar, Edmund Alfred Bickleigh, guilty or not guilty of the wilful murder of Julia Elizabeth Mary Bickleigh?"
"Not guilty."
Well, of course.
"Is that the verdict of you all?"
It is. But for all that, Dr. Bickleigh drew a huge breath of relief and felt rather weak about the knees as he turned to the judge and waited to be formally discharged. Well, that was the end of everything. 8 whole days of it, and now free at last. Well, not technically free. He was still in custody, of course, on that ridiculous attempted murder charge. Oh, that would be taken almost immediately, a mere formality. Everyone knew that. Having failed on the major charge, the Crown could never hope to get a verdict against him in the minor one. Really, the trial just finished had been a trial in a way upon the other charge too. Quite possibly, thought Gunhill, the Crown would enter a nolle prosequi. Anyhow, he had nothing to worry about now. The judge said a few words to him, and Dr. Bickleigh, who had not heard one of them, beamed back vaguely. People pressed forward to shake his hand as he stepped out of the dock, Gunhill and the rest. There was even some attempt at cheering. Dr. Bickleigh felt a hero. Damn it all, he was a hero. There were precious few people who could get away with a killing like that, and now he was out of danger. Ruined, of course. Every halfpenny he had in the world had gone into his defence. He would possess little more than the clothes he stood in. A nice system, that allows that sort of thing to happen to an innocent man? Yes, ruined right enough, but out of danger for good and all. And as for being ruined, well, Chatford had ruined him, and it was only fair that Chatford should be forced to make restitution, and, by God! As with smiling face and nodding head, he accepted the congratulations of those round him, and shook hands that were being continually thrust towards him from all sides, like a cheval de frise, a little spot deep down in Dr. Bickleigh's consciousness glowed and burned with a fierce hatred of Chatford and a determination for vengeance. Chatford. Chatford. To set himself against him. Somebody tapped him sharply on the shoulder, and he looked round into the unsmiling face of Superintendent Allhays. "Better come this way, I think, Doctor. Must remind you, still in custody until—" "Yes, of course," Dr. Bickleigh laughed gaily. "Still got your clutches on me, haven't you? Like me so much you can't let me go, eh? All right, Superintendent." Still laughing, for after all it was rather amusing after being acquitted of murder, Dr. Bickleigh accompanied the superintendent into another room. It was empty except for 2 constables and a sergeant. "Well, lead me to the Black Maria," giggled the little man. "Or are you going to give me a drink first, Superintendent? I can tell you I wouldn't mind one a bit." The superintendent's moon-like face did not alter its expression by a millimetre. "Edmund Alfred Bickleigh, I now arrest you for the wilful murder of Dennis Herbert Blaze-Bourne by administering to him the germs of typhoid fever on the 14th of September 1929. And I warn you that anything you say may be taken down and used in evidence hereafter." "Hey, stop that. You, Sergeant, get hold of him, can't you? Burrows, Sprayton, don't stand there like stuffed dummies." Epilogue. On Monday, the 24th of April, the trial opened of Dr. Edmund Alfred Bickleigh for the wilful murder of Dennis Herbert Blaze-Bourne by administering to him poisonous germs, to wit, Bacillus enterotides. The trial lasted 4 days. Late in the afternoon of the 27th, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. In passing sentence, the judge said, "Edmund Alfred Bickleigh, yours was a commonplace, sordid crime for which I can find no extenuating circumstances whatever. It only remains for me to—" On the 15th of May, Dr. Bickleigh's appeal against this verdict was heard in the Court of Criminal Appeal by the Lord Chief Justice, sitting with Mr. Justice Darlington and Mr. Justice Parbury. The grounds of appeal were A, misdirection by the learned judge in his charge to the jury, and B, that the verdict was against the weight of the evidence. The appeal was dismissed. On the 2nd of June, Dr. Bickleigh was executed for the murder of Dennis Herbert Blaze-Bourne. He protested his innocence to the last. That was Malice Aforethought by Francis Iles, read by Bruce Montague. We do hope you have enjoyed listening to this Chivers audiobook.